Ladies and gentlemen, join me in giving a warm Pachyderm welcome to Mr. Gary Hill.
Dobry den. Bonjour. Buenos dias. Salam alaikum. Good afternoon. The United Nations, as a reminder, because it's international, works officially in 6 languages. And so as we talk about what they do and how they do it, you'll get a little added complexity. We're blessed with some legislators here, and I'm sure they can tell you that negotiations between people that think they speak the same language is not easy. If you add in 5 additional languages, you really have some interesting things going. What I want to do with you, and I emphasize it's with you, and let me apologize. If you raise a hand and I don't see it, go like this. I was in Algeria last week and tore a cornea, and so I can see to drive, but I can't see the close things. So you'll see I'm somewhat locked into my notes at some time, for which I apologize. The beginning of the United Nations, just to give us a little historical background, actually started in 1942, about 3 years before the end of World War II. And it got its name from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who came up with United Nations when he called a number of nations together and said, will we stick together and work together through the end of World War II, which of course they did. At the end of that, when you got into 1945, still just before the end of the war, the United Nations formally came into existence. A year before that, several nations got together, and you can see the names, I think, so I don't have to read them to you, but they put together a set of policies and processes and said, after the war is over, we should keep some type of international organization, and they established the principles at that time. So it was about a year later that they actually got together, put the United Nations together, and they all adopted the principles. Originally, there were 50 countries at the meeting. However, Poland, which was not at the meeting, came in a couple of months later and said, we would like to be one of the originals. So they became one of the original 51 countries of the United Nations. I'm checking to make sure I haven't left things out or misspoken along the way. That's the overall history. I think it's important, especially as we discuss the United Nations today, that we remember where it came from. Like all things we do, history's kind of good to remember, and how it got to where it is. And again, I'm going to have to look closer. There are currently 193 members of the United Nations. The way membership comes into the United Nations is the name is proposed, the country asks to become a member, they're then voted on, and they're accepted by the General Assembly, and I'll explain the different groups in a minute, after they've been approved by the Security Council. Main origins of the United Nations, and I'm going to get close enough where I can really see this because I don't want to mess it up. You've got a series. You've got the General Assembly. These are all names that I think you know. Security Council, Economic and Social Council, usually referred to as UNESCO, the Trusteeship Council, which most of you have probably never heard of, the International Court of Justice, and of course the UN Secretariat. The Secretariat is really the administrative branch of the United Nations, though they get most of the publicity because that's where the Secretary General comes out of. There are 15 members of the Security Council. Of those 15, 5, which I think you know, are permanent members, the United States being one of them. The other members of the Security Council serve 2-year terms, and they're elected by the General Assembly membership. Current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, you're going to be hearing a lot of him because there's a lot going on with the United Nations right now, and especially they're concerned that the U.S. may cut funding, so he's going to be here doing a lot of politicking, and you'll see him on the news quite a bit. I won't go through all of these, but this is the general structure of all of the agencies I'd mentioned. When you talk about the agencies, the Secretariat, as I said, is the administrative body of the United Nations. They're located in New York. You get into the General Assembly. I guess the best way to describe the General Assembly is kind of like a large international town hall meeting. Because people can come in, when I say people, I mean countries. Countries can come in, they can make presentations, they can introduce resolutions, whatever they want to do and talk about, and then it goes through the process. Each country, including the United States, has one vote, and that's been a concern with some people in the United States, saying, how come we spend so much money, we do so much around the world, and some little tiny country gets the same number of votes as we do? Well, that's not exactly true, because the real action takes place at the Security Council. And the Security Council, remember, the United Nations is one of the 5 countries that can veto anything that comes out. And so where the General Assembly can come out with some general resolutions, they really can't do anything with major impact without the United States approving of it. So it's kind of like the Senate and the House, if you will. There's kind of a check and balance there. The only other one that I'll talk about in any detail, because it no longer exists, is the Trusteeship Council. Originally, there were 7 nations that were totally independent, and they weren't really nations. And they belonged to somebody else, Great Britain, other countries. Well, about 4 years ago, the last of those territories gained their own independence. So the committee that was to help oversee them doesn't have any countries to oversee anymore. And so they no longer exist. The name still exists, they don't meet, they don't vote, but the slot is still there when people talk about the major groups of the United Nations. The good of the United Nations, I'll let you read these, but I think they're pretty impressive. And sometimes when we talk about the United Nations, we only think about a resolution we don't like, or we only think about a peacekeeping mission that we don't think is doing everything we want it to do. This fascinates me. 40% of the vaccinations given in the world each year are through the United Nations. 60 million refugees are being taken care of one way or another, and 120,000 people have been involved in peacekeeping missions around the world, and we'll come back to the peacekeepers. In my office, for several years now, I've kept this poster, and all it says is $1,000 US reward to anybody who can report a verifiable case of smallpox that's been transmitted person to person. Now, my vision's a little blurry, but I think there's 1 or 2 in here that may be close to my age. Maybe. And those who are remember, and I remember all through the time I served in the Army, the biggest fear people had was smallpox. It was the greatest killer in the world, it was uncontrollable, and it was wiped out because of the work of the United Nations. And so every time I get down on the UN, I go and I look at my poster and I say, not everything's just one way or the other. Some pretty good things that have happened. I can fly anywhere in the world because civil aviation is under the umbrella of the United Nations. All pilots must speak English. Any pilots in the group? Okay. Then you know that much of the regulations we have, the directions we circle before landing, the light signal, they're the same all over the world. Makes no difference. You can drive anywhere in the world because the road signs, the shape, not the words on them, are consistent because the world community put them together knowing that you and I will go to another country and drive. The United Nations, and I find this fascinating, in only the last decade, the United Nations has made available clean, potable water to 1.3 billion people. in rural areas. That's not bad. So everything they do isn't bad. Some things are pretty good. But then we come to peace. And that's what most of us tend to think about when we talk about the United Nations. And there's both good and bad. And I think most of you can read this. It's not quite as bad as a lot of people think. Can you all see that? Or okay, so no use me rereading it. 42 peacekeeping forces. Now this was as of 1996. Some have been added since then. But as you can see, they have done pretty good in working around the world. There are presently 16 active peacekeeping missions. And those who want a list, I've got one with me, I'll give you. Since 1945, remember the beginning of the United Nations, and a lot of people don't understand the number. 172 peaceful settlements around the world. Not every time there's a conflict does it break out into a war and we send in peacekeepers. But the United Nations is the main negotiator, and 172 provable peaceful settlements have been negotiated because of the United Nations. Wars not fought. Our wars ended. Having said that, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Congo, Israel, Palestine, you know the areas of the world where there's still major problems, and a lot of people say, where's the United Nations? Why haven't they solved it? And we're going to cover that in a little bit more detail. And there's been some very bad with the United Nations. Rwanda, and I worked in Rwanda several times after the genocide, not before. And Rwanda's a country that's really coming together, very interesting right now. But during the time at the start of the genocide, the United Nations had people there and knew of the growing problem and didn't take the action to step in. And consequently, nearly 1 million people died in the genocide in Rwanda. And that's a major failing of the United Nations. We know from reports not only in the Congo, but in Haiti and several other countries, some of the United Nations troops have put together organizations to collect young women and force them into prostitution or use them for sex. They've done some very bad things. And that is now being somewhat controlled, but not totally. And that's, to me, a bad sign that the United Nations should have. Cholera in Haiti. When I worked in Haiti, and I did immediately after the tidal wave and the earthquake, and the place was devastated, we do know that some troops that came in from another country brought cholera with them. It wasn't there before. And cholera spread throughout the entire country. UN moved in. There's some pretty good things that they did medically after the fact, but where the United Nations did not do good, when Haiti said we need compensation, we need to pay for the medical and stuff, the United Nations stepped back and said, no, we're not legally liable. And to me, that's a bad. That's not what should have been. Iraq Food for Oil program, I think most of you are familiar with that. Tremendous sums of money were siphoned off. It was just not only bad bookkeeping, it was corruption at the worst level. Yes, it's been investigated. Yes, there are people working on it, but it happened. And Srebrenica, one of my peacekeeping missions happened to be in Republic of Srpska and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I was there the first time while the war was still going on. Srebrenica was set up as a safe zone. And we had United Nations troops from a particular country stationed there to keep the people safe, and they didn't. And consequently, several thousand people were murdered brutally, and almost in open daylight. And that was a major failing of the United Nations and the command at the time. Being a Republican organization, I assume funding creeps into your thinking every once in a while about the United Nations, so let me give you a little background on the funding. There are assessed dues and there are voluntary dues. And I'll leave copies of this, by the way, if you want to read it in more detail or if you want more information. But basically, the United States is the biggest provider of funds to the United Nations. Now, and I'm going to get close so I can read this because I don't want to screw it up. The regular budget The United States pays the maximum amount. The United Nations assesses countries by their gross income of the nation. Obviously, the United States is the biggest, so we're the biggest share. Because of that, the U.S. pays 22% of the regular budget of the United Nations. That's a lot. Now, it's been negotiated down from 25% in the past. Each year, the United States spends approximately $8 billion in mandatory payments. That's what I talked about before with the 22%. And voluntary contributions. And the voluntary contributions go more to the human rights and the humane types of things. Biggest portion of the money, about $3 billion, goes to the UN's regular and peacekeeping. So about $5 billion is what we give in other contributions through or to the United Nations. Having said that, we're the largest financial supporter of the UN since the very beginning. U.S. is currently 22%, 27% for peacekeeping. Now that was taken as of August of 2010. I tried to look for the newer figures, and I think they're about the same. .4% of our total budget in the United States, and you're going to be hearing this from the right and the left as we get into arguments, 1.4% of the total U.S. budget goes to foreign aid. That includes everything we spend to the UN. So it's not the huge killer one way or the other. But as some of the old politicians used to say, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, it adds up pretty fast. So 1.4 is a lot of money, but it's not the humongous thing people seem to think it is. By the way, our peacekeeping and regular budget is 0.1% of the U.S. budget, of what we spend there. The rest is our voluntary contribution for humanitarian things. For every dollar, now I'm going to let you read this, and I'm going to read it to you because most people do not understand this. Not talking about the humanitarian aid, only our contribution, the $3 billion that we spend as part of our dues assessment for both regular operation of the UN and dues assessment for peacekeeping. For every dollar the United Nations gives to the Secretariat, the United Nations is part of what we owe, we receive back 1.6 in terms of contracts, because much of the things that the United States gives, we put little provisos on it that say, yes, we were going to be giving this and that, but you got to buy it from the United States. That's written into a lot of our negotiations. And the money and the services that come into New York City because of the diplomatic corps that live there and the consulates around, when you figure all that in, and those who want it, I can send you the breakdown. I don't have it with me, but these are not guesses. These are provable. We get $1.06 back. Not bad. Now, if you throw in the other $5 billion for humanitarian contributions, obviously more money goes out than comes in. But from what we're assessed mandatorily, we do pretty good. I think you got enough of that. Peacekeeping. The United Nations, in terms of their peacekeeping operations, is very clever. They have two types, executive and non-executive. Now, they really know how to word things, so it takes all the confusion out. All that means is, if it's an executive peacekeeping mission, it means the United Nations has total control of the country. If it's non-executive, it means the United Nations is there more in an advisory capacity, and they must work with the permission of the existing government, and they have people that will work in justice and in security and the other areas, but they're not the big boss. Now, for every mission, by the way, there is somebody appointed called the Special Representative to the Secretary General. That's the person in charge of each one of the 16 missions. Once that person is appointed, the control of that mission goes from New York, from the Secretary General, to that individual. And that individual has pretty much full power and responsibility because they're working directly with the countries. Almost all of the missions from the United Nations now are non-executive. They're more advisory, even though they may have troops and police and others there. Give you an idea of what the difference is, and I'm going to compare with the United States. United States, and this is from a RAND study that was updated in 2005, but they took 8 missions run, peacekeeping missions, peace-building missions, run by the United States, and 8 run by the United Nations, and they tried side-by-side comparisons just to get a general idea of what the difference might be. Well, let me go back to that. So you can see the countries involved. And of course, when you get in Germany and stuff, we're going back to World War II is where they pick some of the countries for the U.S. The United Nations is an international organization, 193 countries, very political. And so they are entirely dependent upon funds from outside. That's why there's a separate peacekeeping mission. When there is a proposed peacekeeping mission, it goes before the Security Council. The Security Council then writes the mandate. And the mandate generally says what their goal is, how many troops will be allowed. And the United Nations has no police force and no troops. So they come from other countries. And many countries around the world donate troops. UN for the poor countries may pay their salaries, but usually the countries will pay the salaries of their own soldiers as part of their aid. And so the UN, because they're international, is entirely dependent for funding and operations on the member countries and donations. Since 89, they've launched a peacekeeping operation about once every 6 months. Seems like a lot. That's where we came with that 172 figure from before. They're all over the place. Not all of them have a number of troops there. Some of them may just be some negotiators. But about every 6 months, the United Nations is asked to go in to some type of potential regional conflict. The United States, on the other hand, and I don't think I'll get any argument in this room, we are the world's only superpower. And for those of you that have been around or look at the U.S. military, whether we need more, we need less, people can argue that all they want. We're strong. When I was in the Army, all I can tell you is that a single soldier has more firepower and ability than my entire company had when going into battle. We are big and we are mean and we are well known as being very, very strong and well run. Also, the United States commands a large amount of resources. We do not have to go to another country if we want to put money into a particular conflict or a situation. We go to Congress. And we can handle it ourselves if we have to. Since 1989, we've mounted a new military intervention about once every other year. Now, even that's more than I think a lot of us realize, but we are not exactly shy. We have troops in a lot of places, or at least a post in a lot of places. But you can see the difference in style and abilities between the two when we talk about peacekeeping. The United Nations, their influence is more on the moral than the physical. If something bad happens in a military standpoint and the United Nations are there, the world doesn't jump down upon them. They say you could have done better, but it's not a big deal. That's not where they get their pride. They're more concerned with what types of soft results did they come up with. The United Nations mandates are negotiated, very bureaucratic. When I've worked in different peacekeeping missions, they can drive you nuts. When I first went into Liberia, and it was with the corrections unit to help put the prisons back together, what the United Nations bureaucracy decided was, in order for the rebel groups and the incoming government to get along, every post would have people from both. So the deputy prime minister or the minister of justice, one would be from the rebels, and the other deputy of equal power would be from the government. Where you can tell when two people are sitting in an office together making decisions and they've been fighting each other for the last 4 or 5 years, how happy they are to get along together. You think Democrats, Republicans fight? You ain't seen nothing. So you've got a great deal of bureaucracy, and that's why I say it's the ugly of the way some of these things happen. United States, on the other hand, we're more involved with our military presence. We're the biggest mother on the block. Whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or others, we're there, and we're there with strength. And because it's the military, the influence and what we worry about is a little bit different. The audience the U.S. has is Congress and the public, and they're tough. They don't like to see ripples. The U.S. Talks in terms of we're going to bring peace to the area. Very big, very difficult things to prove, where the UN will talk more in terms of we just want the fighting to stop. So you've got two different types of identifiable missions and what the expectations are. The expectations of the United Nations are much less than they are when the United States moves in. So the UN tend to be smaller missions, much safer missions. Of the 8 that we showed in the RAND study, 7 of the 8 have remained peaceful, 6 of the 8 are now democratic. The missions from the United States are large, much more costly than the UN mission. Now here I mistyped 16, and I typed 17, I think there. The cost when we were heavily involved in Iraq was $4.5 billion a month. Now that was more in 1 month than the UN spent on all 17 of their missions. But it was a much more difficult mission, much more intense, much more expensive. So there's some comparisons that work, some that don't, but you should have a general idea of the differences. 4 out of the 8 US missions have remained peaceful and democratic. The other 4 are still in limbo, like the one with the UN. In terms of the ugly, the United Nations original document in 1948 was the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. That's the basic human rights definition, and by declaration, it means it's a statement. I'll use a later example from a standard. Standards, declarations are not enforceable by law. They're what the group says, gee, this would be nice. They're aspirations. If you hear of something from the United Nations that's a convention, Geneva Convention, treaty, covenant, those are enforceable by law. And so a lot of what the United Nations does is aspirational that we hear about. They are not legally binding. In terms of legally binding, the way that countries get involved is the United Nations General Assembly, Security Council will come up with a proposed treaty, such as the Treaty on the Rights of the Child or the Geneva Convention. The political powers of the countries usually will then sign a declaration saying our country intends to follow this. Once they sign it, it still isn't in law. It must come back to the legislative body. So the president can declare we will join this particular treaty or convention, but until it's passed by Congress through debate, it's not binding. Once it is signed, which is what the president would do, and ratified, which is what Congress does, then it becomes law that we're held responsible for. Almost. Every country can then put in reservations on each one of the treaties. For instance, the Treaty on the Rights of the Child, and by the way, every country in the world has signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child except one, and I'll come back to that. The reservations would be something like Egypt. In the Convention on the Rights of the Child, one of the provisions is that no person under the age of 18 can be conscripted into the military. We don't want child soldiers. Egypt came back with the reservation and said, well, our law says we cannot conscript, we cannot draft people under the age of 18. However, we do have within our law where a person who has attained the age of 16 may voluntarily join the military. And we have legislation to protect them from being forced in as child soldiers are anyway against their will. That would be an example of a reservation. When you get into some of the others, between some of the Islamic countries and Israel, you will find some that will say, we agree with all these principles except where Israel is concerned. And so that would be a written reservation that legally protects them. And so the United States, on anything they sign, can put in all types of reservations. And just about every treaty also says, if there is a conflict, before it can go to the World Court, the courts of the nation have a chance to look at it and to debate it and to straighten it out, so it's not straight. The one country, used to be two until 4 years ago, used to be Somalia in terms of the Convention for the Rights of the Child, and the United States. The United States has not signed the Convention for the Rights of the Child. The only reason that most of us can figure out is not because there's anything in there that people in the United States find abhorrent. They tend to find it very good. But there is a fear with some within Congress and some outside who pressure Congress to say, well, wait a minute, if we sign the treaty, then some group from outside the United States is going to come in, look at one of our juvenile institutions, find something wrong, and take us to the World Court. Well, number one, procedurally, that can't happen. But there are people who firmly believe that. So rather than sign on to a treaty that every other country in the world has, we chose to hold back. Someday that may change, some may not. But you can Google the Convention on the Rights of the Child and read for yourself to see if you find anything in there you find that we wouldn't go for. We are still one of the most humane countries in the world, and we exceed everything. But anyway, that's part of the ugly. And I talk about the U.S. because I'm in a U.S. crowd. But I can pick almost any country of the world and show the same types of examples. And this is what happens in negotiations. An example of how some of these things are put together. Standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. Now, they're rules. They are not conventions or treaties. These are recommended best practice. And in 1955, the world community got together and they said we should have minimum rules or standards on how people who are prisoners should be treated. They shouldn't be beaten, they should have food, they should have air, everybody should have their own bed. And they went through and they put together a series of standard minimum rules. In 1955, now a lot has changed in the world in 1955. We now have more women in prison that weren't even a consideration back in 1955. We have things that are crimes now that were never crimes before. The whole thing of terrorism has taken on such a life of its own, some for real, some not for real, by the way, that now many countries have put in laws and procedures that were beginning to get pretty draconian. And so the world community said, let's re-look at the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. What are we missing? As a result, at the United Nations Crime Congress held in Salvador, Brazil in 2010, and as Kathy mentioned, once every 5 years, the United Nations has this major crime congress. And they'll get 175 countries, they'll debate the issues, they'll say, here's the concerns we have for the next several years. One of them that had been talked about for a long time was to revisit the standard minimum rules. Let's modernize them and make them practical in today's world. And so out of the Salvador Congress, a resolution went back to the United Nations that said we should revisit the standard minimum rules. The United Nations has three major headquarters. New York, that you're familiar with, Geneva, which is mainly human rights, and Vienna, Austria, which is this picture of their building there, is where crime prevention, criminal justice, drug control, and the Atomic Energy Commission are housed in Vienna. So the resolution came from the Crime Congress to Vienna to the UN Crime Commission that's made up about 40 members that rotate on 3-year basis. When the United Nations has something new they want to look at that will turn into standards or convention or treaties, they put together a group that they call, what do we call ourselves? Intergovernmental experts. I like that title. And so governments will bring some of their people and the UN will bring in some. And this is the size group for the standard minimum rules. A pretty good sized mob. But it really is the criminal justice experts from every region of the world and some of the top people that you'll get in crime prevention, criminal justice. And their job was to look at the standard minimum rules and make decisions on should there be changes, what shouldn't there be. When we first met, we knew that if we opened up the standard minimum rules for a total relook and rewriting, we'd probably lose them all. Because of the politics of today, people are more likely to vote no than they are to keep some of the basic human rights standards. To protect that, the group suggested to the UN Crime Commission that there be 9 areas that we look at, that were humanitarian areas, areas dealing with women, some of the newer concepts, and that was accepted. So the group then went, looked at all of the rules, had additions, had retractions, and this went on for a couple of years where they put it together. They had meetings, they had other resolutions that were put together. All the material was shared. The Secretariat in Vienna did most of the administrative work. We had a meeting besides in Vienna. We met in Argentina for another face-to-face where we hashed out the rules. They then came back to the Crime Commission. The Crime Commission looked at the draft and said, looks pretty good. Now you can work on the final draft. Now this is a long period of time and a lot of negotiations. The final meeting was held in Cape Town, South Africa. That's the convention center. And that's the resolution that was put together that said, here is where you'll meet. There'll be the 3rd meeting of the committee of experts. You'll do the final writing. So you can imagine all the bureaucracy and the back and forth and the politics, along with good criminal justice policy that was discussed to get here. If you look about here, that's where the convention center is located in Cape Town. This is Robben Island. Robben Island, as I think most of you know, is where Nelson Mandela was held prisoner for many years. Because of the symbolism of Nelson Mandela, both as being a long-term prisoner, as well as somebody who was a champion of human rights, a change was made in normal way the UN does business. Normally, when a treaty or a convention or a standard is put together, it's named after the city where the negotiations take place. The Geneva Convention, the Bangkok Rules. The government of South Africa, with the unanimous consent of the expert panel, said, no, let's call these the Mandela Rules. Let's make it more than just a city because there's a symbolism with it. And so they were passed, and everything was put together, and everybody was happy, and we finished our work, and we were all ready to go out for a beer. And then we remembered 6 languages of the United Nations. All of our work there was done in English with simultaneous interpreters. But the final document is then transmitted, and this is true in most cases. The final document is transmitted to the translation section in New York with the United Nations. Overnight, they translate everything back into the 6 UN languages, and they send it back. Well, we got it back the next morning, and as we're reading it, some of the Spanish delegates are saying, that word you put down there in Spanish doesn't mean what we talked about in English. And the Russians had some problems. As you can imagine, the language then came in. So we started negotiating over individual words and wording. Some of it sounds silly, but to some countries it's very important because there are some countries that are really not particularly favorable to gay, lesbians, transgenders. And they were very concerned with some of the human rights things that said, for everybody. And they wanted to specify and cut it down and move it. Well, that could change the intent of what was originally written. So we started again. We had another full day that was to be our last day. At 6 o'clock at night, the interpreters who are there, because interpreters need to see people face to face to get the feeling of how they're talking, the interpreters left at 6 at night. Their day was done. They work hard. They're a good union. At 2 o'clock the next morning, the rest of us finished our work. We were translating and working for each other, but it got done and it was then sent back. So when I say the ugly, it's not really ugly, but it's negotiations, it's politics, it's culture, it's individual interests, both at its very best and its very worst. It's, the old saying of don't watch sausage being made. This is kind of like that. So that's why I call it the ugly. The final things came back to the United Nations Committee on Crime Prevention, Criminal Justice. They approved it. They passed it on to the Economic and Social Council, which is in charge of councils and committees and organizations. They approved it, sent it to the General Assembly, and from there it was passed, and it's now we have new standards for the minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. With all of that, let me come back for just a second, and I'm going to end with this and tell you what the United Nations really is. People, wanted to know, what's the United Nations?
Well, Somalia, Slovakia, Tajikistan and Syria, Austria, Andorra, Egypt, Angola, Algeria, Antigua, Poland, Portugal, Australia and Albania, Myanmar, Madagascar, San Marino, Mauritania, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Estonia, Malawi and Malaysia, Mozambique and Macedonia, Latvia and Lebanon, Barbados and Liberia, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, Niger and Nigeria, Haiti, Fiji, Mali, Oman, Paraguay, Ukraine, United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, Spain, Serbia, Croatia, Costa Rica and Korea, Micronesia, Indonesia, Czech Republic, St. Lucia, Dominica, Dominican Republic and Rwanda, North Korea, Tanzania, Yemen, Uruguay, Uganda, Sudan, Iran, Japan, Gabon, Guyana, Russia, Ghana, Bahrain, Azerbaijan, Bhutan, Bolivia, Botswana. And Trinidad, Tobago, Togo, Turkey, China, Tonga, Montenegro, Malta, Monaco, Republic of the Congo, United States, Kimber, Sierra Leone, and Cote d'Ivoire, Tuvalu and Mauritius and Morocco, East Timor, Sao Tome and Principe, Burundi, Chile, Italy, Djibouti, and Jamaica, Jordan, Germany, and Hungary, Mongolia, Cambodia, Bulgaria, Namibia, Palau, and Laos, and Liechtenstein, and Luxembourg, and Libya, Guinea, Papua New Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, and Gambia, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Belarus, Brazil, and Zambia, Ecuador, and Equatorial Guinea, and El Salvador, Sri Lanka, Sweden, Switzerland, and Suriname, and Singapore. Plus, Tunisia, Thailand, Cameroon, Qatar, Kuwait, and Canada, Grenada, Guatemala, Cuba, Comoros, and Panama, South Africa, Samoa, Czech, St. Vincent, Vietnam, Benin, Burkina Faso, and Brunei, Jerusalem, and Marshall Islands, Mexico, Moldova, and Maldives, Honduras, Argentina, Kiribati, Kitts and Nevis, Central Africa, the Netherlands, Nauru, and Slovenia, Ethiopia, Peru, and France, and Finland, and Armenia, Iceland, Israel, Ireland, Eritrea, Romania, Kenya, Cyprus, Swaziland, Iraq, and Lithuania, Bangladesh, Bahamas, Belgium, Bosnia, Belize, and Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, and Pakistan, and Greece, and Denmark, also Georgia, and Seychelles, and Senegal, Colombia, the Solomons, the Philippines, Nepal, Congo, Saudi Arabia, Lesotho, Vanuatu. Though I could name the capitals, perhaps it's better not to.
All the United Nations are 193 nations with all their warts and pimples and bad moods and good moods get together in a procedural manner to talk about some of the world's problems, some big, some small. And so you've got lots of things that are good and lots of things that are not, but that's all the United Nations is. And if you think about the world, and obviously I'm a proponent of the United Nations, if you think about the world, where would we be without it? And just take the various philosophical conflicts the United States has with some of our neighbors, with some of the other countries that aren't going to get into a shooting war probably. But there's a place where people can get together and they can at least talk. And as you saw from some of the good they've done, it ain't bad, folks. They've done some pretty good things. So this is presented only to give you a little bit of a taste of the United Nations. Questions or comments?
I'll walk around with the microphone and you can listen for questions.
My concern is that the propaganda war that we're in today with the rest of the world, the Islamic, radical Islamic world and the communist world, I would really like to see the United States get credit for what we do. I'm not that up to date on all the world's languages, but when I watch translated excerpts of UN speeches, I hear about the great Satan, and I hear about us capitalist pigs, and I hear all these put downs from these ambassadors from around the world. And I would like it if our charity said USA on it and not UN. What do you think?
Just very quick. A lot of where you hear that type of rhetoric comes out of individual committees, and it's talked during the committee. It very rarely gets, well, the U.S. being denigrated is almost never in a resolution, but it's part of what people say, and people say stupid things. There have been some resolutions that have come out of the so-called Human Rights Council in Geneva that have been very negative towards Israel. Many think improperly so. Those have not been carried to formal United Nations action. But they're dialogue, and people do have it. The U.S. is well known and well respected for the aid we give. Having said that, when I go to a country and there are sacks of grain from the Soviet Union, it is made very clear that those sacks of grain have been grown in either that particular country or around it. A sack of grain that comes from the United States generally must be grown and shipped from the United States. So the aid is there, but there's always a little bit of negative, why can't you buy ours? But we are well known for our aid. Otherwise, I wouldn't be going to the places I am, because I'm invited by the countries.
Over here.
Checkmate. The powerful five, the current members, five, there's kind of a checkmate type system there. China protects North Korea, and of course, Russia and U.S. others too. Mr. Trump now wants to say hello to the actions of North Korea, but that becomes very difficult with that system.
That becomes difficult if it's the United Nations that's asked to take the action against North Korea.
Right.
I would doubt for almost any nation you'll see forces being put together that are not invited in. The non-executive mission is what the UN does. Does not stop the United States with 1, 2, 3, or 4 partners. That's why we put together coalitions for Iraq that were not necessarily the United Nations. But yeah, China would stop things, Russia would stop things, and very frankly, on certain things, the U.S. stopped things. Up until the last major criticism on this Security Council resolution that criticized Israel for the settlements, the United Nations always vetoed or didn't go along with that. So, but yeah, it's not automatic.
Back here.
The Gatestone Institute has put out information indicating that the Christians in Syria and Iraq have been pushed to the back of the line by the United Nations for refugee resettlement. And I think the genocide and ethnic cleansing that's going on there will stain the UN's reputation going forward just as severely as the debacle in Rwanda. Having said that, a worldwide problem that I think is coming from the United Nations is their groupthink coming out of their climate change, man-made global warming models, and the fact that they are getting involved in areas in terms of scientific inquiry where I really don't think that the scientists should be preeminent and not a group political process. And I think the United Nations is off in the wrong direction there, like your comments. Thank you.
Okay. Let me start with the aid that's provided to Christians. They're no longer there are 60 individual Jews left in Syria, but there's not very many. Most of the aid does go in those countries to Muslim populations. The reason is 90% of the populations are Muslim. The Christian groups are getting aid. Now, is it the same proportion? I don't know. That's the people who are there can tell you better. I don't have enough facts to say one way or the other, but I do know that Christians are being brought out and being protected, as well as some of the others. But remember the regions we're working in and the percentage of the population. If it were something big in the United States or in many parts of South America, and there's hurricane disaster and aid is given, then people would say, well, 90% is going to Christians. Yeah, 90% of the population is Christian. So before you read too many dark details, look as deep as you can. I have not run into much prejudice. In terms of whether the UN should be involved in climate change, and they are, remember that was a Paris Accord by several nations getting together apart from the United Nations. But the United Nations is very involved in climate change. They and the General Assembly and their members think they should be. Some of us think they shouldn't be. Some of us think they should be. That's a political discussion that's going to go on a long time. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, who is the second nation who supports or gives more money or less money than the United States? So we're number one. Who's second?
I'd have to look at my notes. My guess would be, I'd really have to look it up, but I'm going to guess it'd be a country like Canada or one of the others. The Soviet Union does pretty good. But you can Google it and it'll give you the list of contributions. I had it the other day and I really don't remember. But it goes by, in terms of the assessments for peacekeeping or for administration, that goes a percentage that comes from the gross income of the country. So you can kind of figure, who's the biggest economy and who's next. The voluntary contributions is where there's a wide variation. So I just don't know.
Over here with Mark.
Thank you very much for an extremely interesting talk. I actually have two questions. The first is on the situation with the Soviet Union and the Ukraine. What is the UN doing? What do they plan on doing? It's such a blatant violation. It's really troublesome for the people that are there. And then the second question is entirely separate. Can you talk about some of the countries that are not members of the UN? Who are the prominent ones and why are they not members?
Okay, the first one, in terms of action from the United Nations, any peacekeeping action has to go through the Security Council. Russia has one of the vetoes. You don't have to be brilliant to figure out nothing's going to happen there because it's Russia that's involved. That's part of the bad, that's part of the ugly. It's the structure. Now, if we took that away, then we'd be looking at the United States without the power on certain other things, so, flip a coin. And there are other countries now that want that veto power. I do not know off the top of my head, there's supposedly 100 and between 95 and 97 countries of the world and 193 of the UN. I know some of those are still territories that have not asked to be members. Other than that, without looking, I really don't know who the others are, but it's not a major political fight that's the reason they're not in.
No prominent nation that is refusing to be a member?
Not that I know, well, no prominent ones. Now, one of the rules of the United Nations is, and I think there may be two nations in this position right now, if you do not pay your assessment, then they, in effect, kick you out of the United Nations until you do. And I think there are two of the nations that are in that category. They're, as I understand it, minor nations. Some of them may be territories. I know that the Holy See is at the United Nations. They have representatives. They are not counted as a country, but they would be in the 197 countries. So there would be things like that. The Palestinian, by the way, Authority is not a member of the United Nations, but they are given a seat at the General Assembly and at our Crime Commission meetings and others to participate, but they can't vote.
Gary, if President Trump wanted to put together a free zone to keep these people close to their country of origin, is that something that the United Nations could handle?
Probably not, only again because of the veto power of Russia. And Russia's got, in my humble opinion, some other political interest in the region, and they want to become the big dog on the block. And so if the United States put together some safe zone, we could do it with our own coalition of countries. But I think the United Nations would not be able to join into it because the Soviet Union, in my opinion, would immediately back it off.
Gary Hill, let's give him a giant